Okay, so today what we're going to be working on is simplifying square roots. So I'd like you to put me on pause and do the try this, which is just writing down what you think the definition is of a perfect square. Then come back and check your answer. So a perfect square is the product, that means the answer to a multiplication problem. So it's the product of a number multiplied by itself. Okay, like 4 is a perfect square because 2 times 2 is 4. All right, so let's make a list here of perfect squares, okay? And we'll even write down where they come from. So let's start with multiplying 0 times 0. Now, 0 times 0 is 0. So I'm not going to put, that is a perfect square, but I'm not going to put it down in my list because that's not going to help me simplify. So I'm going to start with, and the same thing actually with 1. 1 is a perfect square because 1 times 1 is 1, okay? So actually 1 I'll put down in the list here. So 1 times 1 is equal to 1. So 1's a perfect square. 2 times 2 is 4. So 4 is a perfect square. 3 times 3 is 9. 4 times 4 is 16. 5 times 5, 25. 6 times 6, 36. 7 times 7, 49. 8 times 8, 64. 9 times 9, 81. And it keeps going, right? 10 times 10 is 100. 11 times 11 is 121. 12 times 12 is 144. And the list can go on and on and on forever. All right, so over here on the left, I'm going to put the square roots of these guys here. Okay, so the square root of 1 is equal to 1. The square root of 4 is equal to 2. So remember, when it's asking for a square root, like the square root of 9, it's asking for what number multiplied by itself will give you 9. So remember, the answer is just the single number. It's not, when you ask for the square root of 9, it's not 3 times 3. The square root of 9 is just 3. Okay? That's a common mistake when you're asked what's the square root of 16 and kids will say 4 times 4. It's not 4 times 4, it's just 4. It's what number multiplied by itself gives you the radicand. So then we have the square root of 25, just 5. The square root of 36, just 6. Square root of 49, 7. Square root of 64, 8. I'm going to continue my list of here. Square root of 81 is 9. Let's do a few more. The square root of 100. What number multiplied by itself is 100? That's 10. The square root of 121. What multiplies by itself to give you 121? That's 11. The square root of 144 is 12 because 12 times 12 is 144. The square root of 169 is 13. 13 times 13 is 169. And obviously we could keep going and going. All right, so now let's get into simplifying. So now that you know what are perfect squares. All right, so when we simplify a perfect square, you're going to find the largest perfect square that divides into the radicand evenly. Now remember, the radicand is the number that's under the radical. So this number here, these are all radicands, 20, 16, 275. The numbers in front are the coefficients. Like this has a coefficient of 2. This has a coefficient of 8. This has a coefficient of -4/5. All right, you're going to make a factor tree. Take the square root of the perfect square. Keep the radical and the radicand. All right, so let's start with 20. So you want to find what perfect square divides into 20. Now remember, you're always looking for the largest perfect square that divides into the radical. the radicand, sorry. So remember, I have that written right here, the largest perfect square. Because sometimes there might be more than one perfect square that divides in the radicand, but then you have to keep simplifying, and we don't want to have to do that. All right, so the perfect square that divides into 20 would be 4. So it is the square root of 4 times the square root of 5, right? 4 times 5 is 20, and they're both radicals because that's how you get a radical answer. All right, and then the square root of 4 is 2. Remember, it's just 2. It's not 2 times 2, it's just 2. Notice that I go from the square root to 2. I go from having a square root symbol to not having a square root symbol. And I'm not doing anything to the square root of 5. That's an irrational number. I can't simplify that. So that's actually going to stay like that. So my answer becomes 2 the square root of 5. All right, let's take a look at number 2, where it says 2 the square root of 16. So this 2 on the outside, this coefficient, remember that's 2. Remember, when there's nothing in between a number and something else, it is multiplication. So this is going to be 2 times something. So that's that 2 there. Now notice, hopefully you notice, square root of 16. That's actually a perfect square. So that actually just becomes 4. So my answer to this here is 2 times 4, which is 8. Okay, notice I don't have a radical in my answer because 16 is a perfect square. So when I take the square root of 16, 4, I lose my radical. All right, let's take a look at number 3. Notice I have a coefficient of an 8. So I'm going to bring the 8 down here because that's 8 times. Let's find a perfect square that divides into 200. Now there's a couple. 4 goes into 200. 4 is a perfect square, right? 4 times 8. But there's actually one larger. Now, I'm going to show you what happens if you pick 4. So you don't need to write this down. If I pick 4, I have the square root of 4 and the square root of 8. Now, if you're not sure if you have the largest perfect square, look at the number that's not a perfect square and say to yourself, is there a perfect square that divides into 8? And yes, there is. 4 goes into 8, right? The square root of 4 times the square root of 2. So since that can happen, then 4 is not the largest perfect square. You could do it like this, but you have to do more work. That's why it's easier just to pick the largest perfect square. So the largest perfect square that divides into, hold on, let me just get rid of this. So let me just bring down that 8 again. So the largest perfect square that divides into 200 is actually 100 times 2. So it's the square root of 100 times the square root of 2. Keep bringing down that 8. The square root of 100 is 10. That's an irrational number, the square root of 2. So we're just going to bring that down. Notice there's no perfect square that divides into 2. So I know that 100 is the largest. And now you're going to multiply 8 times 10. So this will be 80. The square root of 2. Okay, let's take a look at number 4. Okay, I have a coefficient. Yes, that is a fraction. It's negative 4/5. And now we're going to simplify square root of 75. So what's the largest perfect square that goes into 75? That is 25. So 25 times 3 is 75. 25 is the perfect square. Notice there's no perfect square that goes into 3. So I know 25 is the largest perfect square. Okay, so let's keep bringing down the fraction. So we have negative 4/5. What's the square root of 25? That is 5. And then we're not doing anything with the square root of 3. Now we need to multiply these. So you can use your calculator for that. Negative 4/5 times 5. That actually comes out to be negative 4. So my answer is negative 4, the square root of 3. Okay, so that's it, and we'll practice some more tomorrow. Everybody have a good day. Have a good night.